Good morning, students. Today we're going to do our lecture on child and adolescent poverty. Before I begin the lecture, I wanted to do a quick overview of what's going on in this week. We're going to start with an introduction. Lots of good information, in fact, very important information has been added into this module's little interface over here. You can see that there's important information about Exam 2, what you should be working on this week, and additional information about supplemental materials. We do have accompanying lecture slides for child poverty. I do not foresee any changes that will be made onto this lecture, so this will stay over here and it will not be changed further. Next we have a documentary on poor kids. This is again one of those documentaries that has a bonus discussion post opportunity following up with that. If you click on the documentary, it should take you directly to the PBS Frontline webpage. You can click play and it will play an hour worth of documentary. Okay, so I did go ahead and post the link directly for the documentary. Right after that, as you can see, we have our discussion post on childhood poverty. You do not have to respond to peers. Make sure that your own individual discussion post is complete and answers all 6 questions. In addition to that, remember that you can participate, like I repeat always, you can participate up to two discussion posts to get up to 10 bonus points. All right, following our discussion post, we have this first report on childhood poverty from the American Psychological Association that really talks about effects of poverty, hunger, and homelessness on children and youth. There are specific topics that you can look into, so I would click on poverty and it goes into more details about the current poverty rates, unemployment rates in America, how exactly is poverty concentrated, the effects and the impacts on child's health and outcome, and all different dimensions of health as well. You're also welcome to click on the other tabs as well. I would click on hunger, homelessness, to see how all of those other variables are correlated to poverty and kind of go hand in hand. So this is a mandatory report that everyone must kind of familiarize themselves with, followed up with the second report that is posted, the British report on consequences in child poverty, that's optional. It actually goes into more details about the health outcomes that are impacted. As far as child poverty is concerned, it is optional. However, I encourage you to read this one as well because we do talk briefly about the consequences of child poverty in our lecture, and to gain further exposure of that content, if you desire to do so, you can go ahead and view this content right here. Followed up with our conclusion for this week, and then we have our Dropbox folders that's been attached to this module for the health planning document lesson plan. You can go ahead and submit it, and our checklist. So that kind of sums up the navigation for this week. Let's go ahead and get started with our lecture for this week. All right. Okay. So in today's lecture, we'll actually document how poverty steals a child's potential, and in doing so actually steals the potential from all of us, from the family, from the society, from the world. I wanted to go ahead and start the lecture with a quote from FDR stating that the test of our progress is not whether we add to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough to those who have little. And that's very true. Poverty is not just a money thing. It's actually much more complicated than that. In fact, in order to leave poverty, one needs many more resources than just money, than just the financial resources. Our lecture today is going to examine the financial resources or lack thereof which contributes to poverty. I'll define specifically what it means to be poor, or what poverty means in America as far as statistical comparisons are concerned. We'll discuss the number of children living in poverty. We'll also examine the impacts of poverty on a child's health. So those lecture objectives have been summarized right here, discussing the idea of poverty and the related concepts, and also examining the impact on a child's health. So what exactly is poverty? It is said to exist when people lack the means to satisfy their basic needs, but how do we measure that? That's a much more important question. And within America and US, we measure it through 3 different statistical means. So the first one is the Federal Poverty Threshold, FPT, and then the second one is the Poverty Guidelines. So what's the difference, and do I expect you to know both of those? That's correct, I do. Let's start with the FPT, the Federal Poverty Thresholds. These are the statistical version of the poverty measure that are actually issued by the U.S. Census Bureau, and they're used for calculating the number of people that live in poverty in the U.S. That's it. Federal poverty thresholds just kind of line up with the U.S. Census Bureau to calculate the number of people, the percentages within each state, within each district, within each city, within each county that live in the number of poverty. And that's where the federal poverty thresholds stop. Moving on to poverty guidelines, these are actually the administrative versions of poverty measures that are issued by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They're actually a simplification of the federal poverty thresholds, okay? And then they're used in determining the financial eligibility for several federal programs. Some of them uses a percentage multiple of the guidelines, like the 120% below the federal poverty threshold, the 150%, the 200% of the poverty guidelines. So the point is that the poverty guidelines are sort of created with this baseline provided from the federal poverty threshold, and then they have their own formula, but they utilize the numbers from the FPT, and then they turn out their own numbers to determine the eligibility of federal aid programs. You can look at SNAP, you can look at food stamps, TANF, reduced priced lunch meals, everything and anything that fits into that category that has to do with federal poverty guidelines. That's what we use those numbers for. So the federal poverty threshold, how would you define it? It's the statistical version of poverty. It's measured by the U.S. Census Bureau. I did want to define specific numbers of the thresholds so I got some numbers from 2015 for you. For example, what exactly is an FPT for a family of different number of people? So for a family of one, it would be $12,000 and $12,071. For a family of two people, it's about $15,379. For a family of three people, $18,850, and then for a family of four, about $24,000. So you get the picture that these are measured by the U.S. Census Bureau, and we have different numbers, of course, for families with different number of people, or families with different sum of people. Again, a summary, what exactly is poverty by the poverty guidelines? And I've created these slides to give you an overview of how these numbers compare between each family's numbers for the guidelines and for the federal poverty thresholds, and also to kind of give you a summary of what exactly the poverty guidelines are, what exactly are the federal poverty thresholds. So the poverty guidelines, those are administrative versions that are developed, again, by the Human Health and Services, and they're used in setting eligibility criteria for a number of programs. I gave you some examples earlier. Additional examples include Head Start programs, food stamps, Job Corps, National School and Lunch Breakfast programs. And if you notice the number for the guidelines, for a family of one, it's about $11,000. So it's a little lower for a family of one, but see how it changes down the road. For a family of two, they've increased the guidelines, the poverty guidelines, to about $15,930. And if you compare that to the previous slide with the FPT numbers, they're a little lower. You see that right there? Okay, so you see kind of a trend that's developing here. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to give you some differences between these terminologies over here. We have two terms here, generational poverty versus situational poverty. And after you also watch the documentary for kids, these differences and this terminology will become even clearer. Let's go ahead and define these two terms. Generational poverty is basically a child that is born in a family which has been poor for 2 or more generations. And usually the risk factors that contribute to generational poverty are lack of education that is correlated with not being able to break that circle of poverty. Whereas situational poverty is shorter time and is caused by circumstances such as illnesses, divorce, and natural disaster or war. So these are all life circumstances that were really not foreseen by the individual or by the family, and they're kind of unprepared to handle or deal with that. And all the cases and all the case studies from the child poverty documentary depict situational poverty, where every family had an individual who either lost a job or was suffering from an illness or was a single parent family and was therefore unable to break that circle of poverty because they weren't really prepared to handle with the circumstances that were about to come into their lives. How many The question is, how many U.S. children are actually poor? So we're going to have some very established criteria to be able to answer that. First of all, what exactly does poor mean as far as numbers are concerned? So when we look at data and we say, okay, that much percentage of the United States is classified as poor, we're looking at a specific numbers criteria. For poor, it's any family or individual below the 100% of the federal poverty threshold. Now remember, we're looking at federal poverty threshold again because we're purely looking at U.S. Census Bureau and how population can be identified under each program. When we start talking about eligibility again for federal aid programs, we're again going to refer back to the poverty guidelines. So making sure that you are keeping that distinction pretty clear. So the first category, like I said, was poor, and that is any individual or family that is living below the 100% of the federal poverty threshold. The second one is going to be near poor, that is between the 100% and 199% of the FPT. So anywhere from 100 to 199%, it's a pretty big category, is classified as near poor. A very big majority of the United States population fits under the first two categories, and we're going to look at that backed up by other additional data as well. Low income category includes both the poor and the near poor, so like I said earlier, a huge majority of the United States population fits under these first two categories. This category together has a name that is called the low income category, and that includes both of these, the poor and the near poor. After the low-income category, we have the above low-income category, and that is at or above 200% of the federal poverty threshold. Okay, now the problem is that statistics don't really capture the minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour, day-by-day cost of poverty. The Children's Defense Fund actually found a significant rise in the number of children that were experiencing extreme poverty, which is a family of 3 that has an annual household income below $600 to $400. And again, we're seeing an increase in cases of situational poverty. So what does the statistics mean? We have lots of data to really help us identify where our program should focus, what our policy focus should be, our intervention focus should be. However, when we look at situational poverty, these circumstances and these situations change by, on a minutes basis, on an hourly basis. And we are seeing an increase in the rise of extreme poverty that is due to exclusively situational poverty. So these numbers definitely are changing pretty quickly. Now let's look at some data from the National Center for Children in Poverty. And this one specifically focuses on children under the age of 6 years. It's from 2013, so it's less than 5 years old now. And it's pretty relevant still. Figure 1 uses some of the terminology that we have identified before and we've looked at before. The low income category, the above income category, poor, near poor, all of that, all of the terms that we just looked at in this slide. Right? All right, so let's go ahead and apply it to this chart right here. In this case, specifically children under the age of 6 years. 25% of them are under the category of poor, which means they have a household income that is below 100% federal poverty threshold. Then the other 23% is a near poor category, which means their annual household income is from a federal poverty threshold of 100 to 199%, and that applies to this particular category. So both those together combined make up about 48% of children under the age of 6 years that are in low-income households. And then the other 52% are above the low-income household that are at or above the 200% federal poverty threshold. Now that you know how to really apply those terms and those figures to this graph right here, let's go ahead, this pie chart right here, let's go ahead and apply it to this one as well. So this pie chart is about children from ages 6 to 11. And these are children in middle childhood by family income as well. So in this one right here, we're saying that what we're looking at is that the number of children that are in the low income category are actually decreasing. So about 45% compared to the previous pie chart of 48%. And the above the low income category, which is sitting at 200 or above the 200 federal poverty threshold level, is at 55%. The next pie chart is from 12 to 17 years of age, children aged 12 to 17, and this is focused completely on adolescents. We're seeing another further decrease in terms of the low-income children specifically within the poor category that is now further reduced to 19%, and then the near poor category that is reduced to 21%, and the a rise in the above low income category to about 59%. So before we jump into statistics specifically focused on Texas, I wanted to kind of give you an overview of what's exactly happening. Children who are susceptible most to poverty are children that are the youngest, children who are most vulnerable, and children who are under the age of 6 years of age. Our data, as we can see from here, depicts that the youngest children are also living under the highest level of federal poverty threshold of about 48%, and then that figure changes as a child grows older. As a child grows older, to 6 to 11 years of age, to reaching adolescence, and we see it at its lowest during the age of adolescence. Now, there can be several factors that are involved, specifically during the adolescence where a child is possibly able to contribute to their own household income by working part-time or getting odd jobs, anything that could contribute to their own side income, to the family's household income. So that could be a big contributing factor in decreasing the statistics during the adolescence. During middle school age, it could be odd jobs, it could be family's dynamics that are changing, it could be the family's overall household income. It could be several things that are involved. However, the sum of this data is that the children who are most vulnerable to childhood poverty is children under the age of 6, as backed up by our national data. Now I think we're ready to go ahead and look at specific statistics from Texas. So let's go ahead and scroll down. This data is focused specifically on children that are living in Texas, in the state of Texas, and the data is again from 2013, so it's not very old. In fact, it's very relatable. And when we're looking at the divides here, it's very, very evenly divided. Children who live under 100% federal poverty level, that particular percentage is about 25%. So 1/4 of Texas children, all ages, live in below 100% federal poverty threshold level. Then the other quarter, other 25%, I mean, it states 24%, but it's pretty close to a 25 when I looked at exact numbers. So another quarter is between 100 to 200 federal poverty threshold level. So about 50% of children in the state of Texas live in a low-income category or have household incomes that are in the low-income category, and then the other 50% is in the above the low-income category. So we have a really even divide here. So the low-income children, as I stated, 50% in the state of Texas is a much higher statistics compared to the national statistics of about 44%. So we have about 6% higher rate of children in Texas that are in the low income category. What do these numbers mean? We see a further increase in percentages in above income and decrease in percentages in low income. The most vulnerable group to childhood poverty is the group of children under the age of 6, and like I stated that earlier, we see that backed up by national data that children under the age of 6 suffer the most from poverty and have the highest rates, in fact, of childhood poverty. And this is a group also that is completely reliant on their parent. Their caregiver cannot provide for themselves, so they're very helpless in that aspect and are completely dependent on their income providers, who could be a parent, a guardian, a foster parent, an institution, whatever that may be, but they are completely dependent on that. And that is perhaps why we see such a high rate of childhood poverty in that level, because if these children are not taken care of, then that's definitely contributing to that high number. We're looking at numbers from the state of Texas. And like I said earlier, the low-income children, that particular statistics is about 50% in the state of Texas compared to the national statistics of 44%. So in that aspect, we definitely have some room to improve and to make our numbers better. Looking at poverty in Texas and then specifically in Nacogdoches. So in Texas, 29% of the children that are under the age of 18 are poor. We were looking at all ages, and that's why that statistics was about 25%. But when we look at specifically under the, under 18, that statistics rises sometimes to 29%. This is 1 in every 4 kids in Texas. Specifically in Nacogdoches County, where our median household income is a lot lower than the national household income, we're seeing at about $37,000 in the Nacogdoches County, and more than half of the county actually has income below $35,000. More than half, which is about 46. In fact, I think It's way over 46.5 that has income that is below $35,000. Looking at the median household income within the state of Texas, it's sitting at about $55,000 and nationally at $59,000. So looking at those numbers right here and comparing our median household income, we're definitely a lot lower. So there's a higher rate of poverty within our county as well. 1 in 11 kids does not have their means to pay for the necessities of their life, and this is on a national level when we're looking at a household income of $59,000. So imagine what would the statistics be when the household income is at about $37,000. I wanted to share some more statistics with you. In low-income families, children are twice as more likely to die from birth defects, 3 times more likely to die from all causes combined, 4 times more likely to die in fires. Of course, this is due to the living situation, the household, the home situation, having proper exits designed and placed in. Not having access to that could be the factor that is contributing to this high number. Children are also 5 times more likely to die from infectious diseases and parasites, and then 6 times more likely to die from any other diseases. When we look at impacts of poverty, low-income children actually get caught up in their parents' struggles and experience the impact through unmet needs, low-quality schools, and unstable circumstances. And unfortunately, we see that children as a group are a disproportionately poor group. And unfortunately, also, poverty stacks the cards against them. It decreases their, ability to develop resilience and emotional reserves to fight off unhealthy circumstances. It kind of saps their spirit and their sense of self-identity, their self-confidence, and also devalues their potential. And most importantly, it subjects them over time to physical, mental, and emotional assault, injury, and indignity. Furthermore, rarely if ever is shortage of income the sole cause of these problems. And like I said earlier, when we look at poverty, we're not just looking at lack of financial resources. We're looking at a much bigger picture of how it really contributes to a child's overall mental, emotional, physical health, and how the lack thereof is compromised because they don't have access to those facilities. And a lot of times, the answer is a lot bigger than just having access to money or access to a greater income. Poverty leads to several other problems that are often the causative factors to a lot of child and adolescent health issues. So we must understand that poverty exposes children to greater risk and how it overall increases the rate of fatality among children. For example, birth defects, fires, and diseases have many risk factors other than poverty. So this particular picture right here is really interesting because it talks about how poverty contributes to all of these right here, which then impact the early brain development. And when we're talking about the early brain development, we're looking at brain development from birth up until the first few years of life, when the child is really receptive to all kinds of environmental factors and all kinds of environmental cues, and really uses them to shape up how they will respond to stresses at different ages of life. So when we're discussing the early years of child development, there is a significant evidence to prove that early experiences, especially the first years of life for children's emotional and intellectual development, do play a huge part in shaping up the child's life. The window of opportunity for brain development is from the prenatal period, of course, and we've talked about that in our maternal health lecture, to the first year of life, and it's huge, and therefore we have all of these support programs to decrease the risk factors. Now, all the children that are exposed to the risk factors during this period, but children in poverty are unfortunately exposed to a disproportionate amount of those risk factors. So what do I mean by that? We are never going to live in an ideal situation where no child is exposed to any of these. Every child will be exposed to this in some measure, but unfortunately, poverty exposes children to a disproportionate amount of these factors at a very early age in life when you want to have an increased number of positive experiences for the child. And unfortunately, they then impact the early brain development. An example, so I kind of summed up all that I said right there in the previous slide, in this slide right here, and I wanted to give you an example. So exposure to environmental toxins, that's also listed in our category over here, right here in the middle. And you may think, how could poverty lead an exposure to environmental toxins, which would then impact early brain development? In some of the previous lectures, I've given you an example of houses that were painted prior to 70s, and at that time, some of the paints had lead in them, and as far as the ingredients and the content is concerned, and lead when a child is exposed to it at a very early age is very detrimental to their cognitive brain development. So in those old homes that were built prior to 1978, when they were painted with those ingredients and children lived in those, they had slowed mental development, and they were obviously experiencing some kind of developmental barrier. And upon further research and further assessment, we found out that the causative factor was an environmental toxin that was lead that was found in the house's paint. Unfortunately, in a situation like this, when a parent or a family would not be able to afford a proper living, may end up in a housing that is old, that has not been inspected by the health inspection, by the household inspections, and that's why in this situation where a child may have exposure to those environmental toxins. So it's a very far-stretched example, but it has happened. It has happened. It is real. Children have been impacted by environmental toxins such as lead through this way, where a family was living in an older house that was not really inspected, and unfortunately children started to experience developmental delays because of that. So this has happened in the past, and it really allows you to see how one thing could tie in one another, and poverty is the lead cause of all of that, that has allowed the child to be in that situation where they had exposure to environmental toxins. So just one example to kind of really allow you to tie in those examples that we talked about. I also wanted to give you some hidden rules that have been posted on D2L, but how do I want you to look at those? I want you to check out this sheet that's posted, first of all, on D2L. It's very interesting to see what are the driving factors for each group and how money, possession, items, relationships can be viewed with different perspectives. What I don't want you to do is to make assumptions about intelligence, of how someone may understand the hidden rules, how someone may not understand hidden rules, because if you'll see, it's different for each category. And we need to talk about those hidden rules and acknowledge the differences. I think that's the best way to initiate a dialogue and to really see how each category, based on annual household income, views items such as food or shopping or social life or attraction, love, emotions like these, and needs differently. Lastly, remember that the documentary Poor Kids has been posted on D2L. However, I also have created an access to the video through this lecture. So you can click on that and it will take you directly to PBS's webpage where the documentary is playing.